button done up. I'm very relaxed, as you can tell. I've been stretching.
And is it mind? Is mind medicine? Is that you full time now?
No. I'm associate professor of psychotherapy at a place called Icon, and also do some clinical work, clinical supervision for integrative psychology, and then do the Mind Medicine Institute work as well.
So can we just go over what psychotherapy is for, because I don't know, and this is something that you get an agreement, you're like, oh yeah, yep, no worries, I know what that is. So psychology, not what psychotherapy?
Well, psychotherapy means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, first of all, but psychotherapy comes from the Greek psychotherapia, which means therapy for the soul or the mind. So psychology is really a science, first and foremost. It's the study of the mind. And then they apply certain therapeutic strategies like CBT, and that's a kind of psychotherapy. Yeah. So you might say that psychology developed out of research, but psychotherapy as a practice developed out of working with problems, in particular working with problems of trauma. So mid-1800s, you have the rise of what they called the hysteric, people who are very unwell, traumatized women. You had
is that a hysteria? That is a fairly that's a female derived word, isn't it? Like
hysteria. It's literally its original formulation was that it was caused by a wandering uterus.
Yeah,
that's where the dildo was invented, wasn't it? As a treatment for female hysteria.
That's right. Look at you, mate.
Oh. Mate, I've done my research on sex toys.
Medical historian. Is one of the treatments for hysteria, but along with hysterectomies and a whole bunch of other things, Freud famously developed psychoanalysis, which was a response to the treatment of hysteria. So the history of psychotherapy is really bound up in the treatment of trauma. And psychology is really about the study of the mind and the study of how these therapies work and their effectiveness and those things. But psychologists practice forms of psychotherapy.
Yeah, I was going to say, because the way you're explaining it now, it's almost like psychologists are not really the right people to be treating problems.
Well, no, I mean, they're trained in particular kinds of psychotherapy. So in particular, there's a lot of focus on cognitive behavioural therapy in Australia for psychologists, and it's not that any of these are right or better or any of those things. You've got psychiatry, you've got psychologists, you've got psychotherapists, you've got counsellors, you've got social workers. All of them do really important jobs, and all of them are really, really good at different things. And there's a lot of crossover between them as well. And really the efficacy of an approach, is probably the wrong way of thinking about it. I think for me, the most important thing is the quality of the person who's conducting the therapy. That's really the instrumental thing that decides how good or how useful it often is. So, I wouldn't want to criticize any of those approaches, but my view is that we need to take a broad-based approach to treatment. We need to use whatever works, wherever that comes from. So whether that's from science or whether that's from a different culture or whatever it is, if it's going to help, I believe we should find ways of using it.
Yeah, and I mean that's what we're hoping a lot of our audience will get out of podcasts with people like yourself is like there's so much white noise out there, and if you've got to find it yourself, like I had to, it's the hard way to do it. And it takes 5-6 years to figure some of this stuff out. Yeah. And when I eventually did decide it was time to go and see a psych, I realised now I should have done it 10 years earlier. But it was just starting from scratch and without any kind of education. It was like a psych's a psych. Psychiatrist, psychologist, I know they're different words. Yeah. Don't know the difference in anything else. You go to a GP, they send you to a psych. And it's like, I had to go psych shopping to find someone that started to, but I eventually found a dude who you could tell came from a pretty touchy past, and I'm like, this dude's learned some shit along the way, and then I got along a lot better with him. But is there like a default model? Because I speak to people now, and they're like, dude, for what you're looking for, you need to see a psychotherapist. Because I want someone to break me and then put me back together.
Yeah, well, I mean, we could talk about that, but no, look, when you look at psychotherapeutic research, what we know is that therapeutic technique or modality is one of the smallest contributors to the efficacy of the treatment. The most important thing is the therapeutic relationship. And the most important thing within therapeutic control is the therapeutic relationship. So it really is about finding people you fit with, people that feel like they're a good fit to you. And great psychotherapists have the capacity to shift who they are and how they are to meet the needs of the people they're with. And look, psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, all of the great ones have the capacity to do that, I think, is figure out how to be in order to meet you. I did a lot of training in Jungian psychology, and one of the great things I learned in that training was we watched these really old archival videos of Jung's patients. And for those who don't know, Carl Jung's a very famous psychiatrist, psychoanalyst. And they all said something similar. They all said, he knew who to become for me. He was able to be who I needed him to be. I learned a lot from that. There's a kind of protean quality that good psychotherapists have, being able to match. Like, I know I've worked quite a lot with soldiers, and often the complaint is they've been treated, by, a young 20-something psychologist, doesn't know anything, speaks to them in formal technical language, does all these kind of things. And, I'll sit down with them, and I'm, big and got tattoos and all that stuff. And I'm like, yes, what's going on, mate? He's like, oh, not much, So I've heard you picked up a bit of head noise. You want to talk about it? Not really. I'm like, all right, fair enough. Well, just give me the sit rep on what we're doing here then. What's this about? And straight away, just the change in language, the change in style, just puts people at ease and allows them to reach in. I often say when I'm teaching this, particularly when you're working with soldiers, is you have to move from being a doctor to being a doc, right? Like this difference between a doctor, the person who you get sent for evaluation, the person who has the power to, give you the boot, do all these things that actually might be against your will, versus a doc, the person who is there, is with you, is, some of the
embedded
good ones.
or like the RAP docs.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say the good doctors shoot back, right?
Yeah.
So So those are one of the features that as a psychotherapist working in that space, I think is really important to cultivate, is a way of relating to and connecting to the lived experience of what these people have gone through.
So is that something like learning to be or shift your, what you need to be for someone? Is it so that they can draw that respect to you? Like, I'm trying to draw this down a path of like the placebo. They have to trust and believe what you're saying. Otherwise, they're not going to take on any of...
Well, of course, a trusting, safe relationship is the most important feature of the therapeutic relationship, and you have to be able to build trust. Now, how do you build trust in situations where people feel fundamentally unsafe? You can't demand it. You have to earn it. And, in situations where, particularly I'm going to keep drawing this back, obviously, to soldiers, but trust is the moral imperative, right? When you're downrange, you're in a real life situation. You need to be able to trust the people have your back, got your six. That's an important feature. So how does someone who's not of that world and not of that space earn that trust? How do you do that? Well, it's not easy to do. You have to find a way of connecting. Otherwise, it's something that's always coming from the outside, and it's always being done to, and it's not a working with. And so, I often, make the joke, when I'm when I'm teaching this stuff is, every soldier loves a good mission, and the treatment has to, in some sense, become a mission that you are on together, that we're collaborating together on this journey, on this task, and this is the next thing for us to work through and work on together. And if you can activate that collaborative, connected register, a lot of things can happen.
Yeah, because you see a lot of that fit between, like, do they do a psycho, like, when you're teaching young students to become psychiatrists, they you psychoanalyze that particular demographic that you're going to go on and treat? And
well, not so much psychoanalysis, but yeah, it would learn about. I'm very big on, when I'm teaching this stuff, is very big on the idea of the subjective experiences and trying to get to the inherent personal meaning complexes. So if you look at the DSM, post-traumatic stress disorder is categorized by a number of things, and if you've got that, then you've got PTSD. But that, to me, has always seemed quite foolhardy, because a soldier who's suffering from PTSD is very different from a molestation victim, who's very different from a bushfire survivor, who's very different from someone who's had a home invasion, there's different qualities to them. And it's really important to understand the moral and psychological qualities of each presentation type. Have you guys read Jonathan Shea's book, Achilles in Vietnam? Have you?
No.
Fantastic book. One of the great gems in this space. He wrote Achilles in Vietnam, and the other one was Odysseus in America. But in Achilles in Vietnam, he uses this term moral injury to talk. You've probably heard that term.
Oh, it's the new PTSD replacement. When they realised PTSD therapies weren't working for most veterans, they're like, it's got to be something else. When they jumped straight to moral injury.
Yeah, so that's Jonathan Shea's term, right? Is moral injury, and understanding, from a clinical perspective is really interesting, because you can explain something but not understand it. And how does a civilian understand war, for example? How is it possible to understand it? The moral and social register of civilian life in Australia has a whole series of values and assumptions that are completely ruptured in the context of war. I think they're completely an anathema to each other. And so it's very easy, I think, to judge from a comfortable external position with a set of moral values that actually don't apply in the moral context of warfare. And trying to really understand that, is it's hard as a clinician. I've certainly found it hard at times, hearing certain things, that my moral kind of response in this world is like, oh, that's not okay. But then getting into the contextual experience of like what it's like being there in this situation, you're like, oh, geez, yeah, that's actually...
It's stuff that stops getting black and white and in that grey area, isn't it, where we live?
That's right. That's right. And I think that's important.
It's going to get worse, but over time, if we keep going the way we're going, because the way Western society is now built and the morals and the values that we're pretending are the ones that exist in the whole of the real world, they're getting very disconnected from the third world. They're getting very disconnected from death and violence.
That's right.
And the more we insulate, especially young people that grow up with none of it, they've never experienced death, they've never experienced violence or any real threat, their morals and values are definitely going to have a bigger disconnect from that of soldiers. And that's when we start to see the general public really not liking military members when they come back from war, because they believe that is still barbaric and that we're 100, 200 years behind them.
Yeah.
It's like, well, it's the same political leaders that are manufacturing both of these kind of mentalities.
What's that quote? Was it Orwell? He said, for you to sleep comfortably in your bed, there are
men or something.
Bad men in dark places doing terrible things or whatever it is,
On your behalf.
On your behalf, yeah, exactly. Tell me, what do you guys, how does that all play into, I guess, the recent controversy with Ben Roberts and all those things. Where does that all sit?
I mean, we get asked this a fair bit. We don't always comment on things that units that we weren't a part of kind of got into, but I think it's fairly, the moral problem's fairly black and white. We had a bunch of soldiers that did a bunch of things that you can't do in Pitt Street in Sydney.
Yeah.
But there's also no terrorists trying to cut your head off in the Pitt Street in Sydney. And I think the big issue, and it's been harped on social media when people go crazy, but if you take young men or young boys, convert them to men to become soldiers, and then that is their life, and you indoctrinate them with the values, and then essentially you provide or you present them with what you have convinced is an evil opponent, and then they go overseas once, twice, three, and you realise that evil actually exists, and there is people doing evil things over there. Yeah. And then you keep sending them there over and over and over and over again. They're spending more time in that world than they are in this one.
Yeah.
And so we cannot then have people who have never been from the Western bubble into this world judging them on their actions. Right. They just haven't been.
Yeah.
I don't think you find a soldier who's been to the Middle East that does not look at those guys and go, I would have done the same thing.
Yeah.
And that, yes, there is some stuff that I wasn't there, so I don't understand the full situation. Yeah. But I understand it far better than most of the people judging them back home. And the big problem I've got is the same people judging, saying they're all murderers and baby killers and whatever. They are the same people that the minute they are mildly threatened, turned into the grossest fucking just spitting hate at everyone, and they want the whole world to burn and die.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's confusing, but I mean, I understand kind of why they're getting that way. I just think the people in this Western bubble, they need more exposure to adversity.
Well, I think it's an interesting idea, isn't it? There's something interesting in what you've said there. If you look at the current cultural context, what you want to call it, wokeism or identity politics gone rabid, or regressive leftism, or whatever it is you might want to call it. Yeah. It's a kind of interesting situation because really for the first time in human history, we haven't sent whole generations of people off to be killed. So really, in some ways, we live in the safest world, in the safest time in all of human history. And in some sense, there's a sensitization to the history of human barbarism and trauma. Like there's a sensitization that's happening to that. And I think that's what a lot of that stuff's about. I just think a lot of the ideas that are used to propagate it are pretty poorly thought through. They're not good ideas, but it is an interesting moment. And the claims towards human sensitivity and kindness and all those things are really important. But as you said, one of the ironies is that there's a kind of militancy to the way those ideas are put forward, and a real lack of compassion and understanding to, when we talk about service people, I mean, to the sacrifices and risks that those people have taken, because you'd have to wonder how some of those same people might fare in that kind of adversity.
Yeah, I mean, the ones that haven't been, I can make a ballpark judgment on how they'd fare. Not amazingly. So, I don't want to go too deep into the fact that you're a philosopher as well. We can get to that in a minute, but I'd love to understand your kind of opinions on this one. It's like, utopia to me is unachievable in our lifetime anyway.
Well, it's utopia means no place.
Yeah, well, there you go. Good. But I mean, that's what. So you speak to young people who have grown up now, like whatever generation they are, and it's like their take on it is to get to as close as we can to being good humans. That's a positive thing that we are separating our understanding of war, because we don't want to be around death. We don't want to be around violence. If we can not be exposed to it, yes, we are far more, vulnerable to any symptoms you get from that kind of trauma. But at the same time, they look at it and they go, well, if everybody could just stop the violence, then the violence would go away. And in my mind, like the polar opposite to that is you have hard times that create hard men. And when we have some superpowers still that we're unsure, like if we become if we remove our exposure to this danger, threat, and violence, and we have multi-generations of softer people, we are fucked. If China or Russia looks at us like, then they're not becoming woke, they're becoming sheep, and that they're going to get eaten.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, isn't it? And the question of what kind of society you wish to live in. And there are all sorts of interesting reverberations through these ideas. So, for example, you're pointing out China and Russia and places like that, which are on the move politically and economically. It's a very interesting thing. China will not hesitate to call out the racism of Australia or America or any of those places, right? Because they know that at home how disruptive it is.
Yeah. But
there are no non-Chinese people in the Chinese Parliament. There's no one. There's no black people. Leading Russia. I mean, the diversity that exists in these countries are governed by kind of liberal sensibilities, and really, what we're talking about, in some ways, if we're talking about the philosophical question, is you're talking about the tension between the values of a philosophical liberalism and the products of postmodernism. They're really the kind of philosophical kind of points. Now, postmodernism arrives in the 1960s and starts to view the world in some pretty strange ways, but in particular starts to view the world as being constructed by hierarchies of power, and that there is no real truth. There is no objective truth. There is really just power, and that it's good to fight subjugation and power wherever you find it. And it's that ideology which is developed by people like Lyotard and Michel Foucault and people like that really gets kind of activated into what we would call, wokeism kind of today. Ironically, though, all the liberation that occurred really happened before this philosophy came about. So it's the liberal values of honouring diversity and difference that really allowed for the rise of feminism, the civil rights movement in the United States. All those things are really a product of a liberal sensibility, a liberal philosophical sensibility, which really values difference and civil discourse and an adherence to a set of kind of shared values around what a society should be like. But this has always been a problem. It's a problem in democracy generally. Plato pointed to the problems of that democracies would nearly always be destroyed by a tyrant. By the very nature of them, they create the kernels or the seeds by which their own destruction can be sowed.
Was there minorities destroy democracy ultimately being part of something as diverse as that? I think even Hitler might have said something like that, to the point where you go, China doesn't do it. They have a 100-year plan. You cannot do it. No one's, even Japan. You go to Japan. Yeah. They're racist. They are their immigration policy is still no. Yeah. Yeah. You're like, okay, what about mosques in Japan? You're not building one. Yeah. No one's blowing up the Japanese.
I still don't have a problem with that. So they're not. You go there from any country in the world. There might be some, but they hospitably, you go there as a tourist, and Japanese people love you. Do they want you to live there forever? Do they want you to bring their culture in and blend the pool? Not so much.
No, but there's tensions there as well, because there's a great deal of benefit that's derived from multicultural societies. So, the United States, Australia, the wealth that has been achieved in those countries is largely achieved through the benefits of migration. And the rich cultural tapestry of it is incredibly valuable. I mean, just think about, what it's like living in Australia today and the cultural diversity here. It's a great thing. But that's a secondary point, I think, to the change in values. Yeah. So what I'm saying is that a liberal value system is something like, you can believe what you want to believe, and I'll believe what I want to believe, and we'll talk about it, and we'll talk about it civilly and reasonably, and in this discourse of civility, if we can come to an agreement, that's great. If we can't, that's also okay. You think about, who was that? Pascal, I think, said, I will not agree with everything you say, but I'll die for your right to say it. That's the basis of a kind of liberal sensibility. Now there's some changes happening where that liberal sensibility is kind of being co-opted, where language itself has gone through these strange times. So a lot of the time you hear this kind of sense that violence is not violence. Yeah. So if in a certain context it's okay to attack or hurt somebody because what they're saying is hurtful or hateful to certain people. So violence is not violence, but words are violence. You see, so there's this very strange kind of inversion that starts to happen where words and the perceived meaning of words becomes more threatening and more morally reprehensible than the righteous application of violence upon a person who said something you don't like.
Is that because people can see the power of words, and when you talk about these great orators that could, or firebrands, I suppose, that could just really, start a movement, and is that why they're sort of trying to get away from it?
No, I think people don't like having their feelings hurt. I mean, I think that's what it is you have these kind of conversations with people, and if I disagree with this, then it's not just a disagreement, it's actually an attack on me as a person and my identity, and it hurts me. Like I physically feel like it's hurt me somehow. It's like, it's just a conversation, mate.
I think the identity piece is the kicker, because you can have, I've had plenty.
Identities?
As soon as I have, no, well, that too. But as soon as I have a couple of beers, I generally get into opinion-based, we'll call them conversations to keep it friendly spin. with people that I've just met, right? Because if I'm opinionated and so are they, I love a good debate. And it's always friendly. But I had one the other night with a young girl. She was a Indigenous lawyer, and she does a lot of stuff on. I don't know what exactly she specialises in, but I said some things, and they weren't offensive to her at all. And I was just saying, hey, these opinions have been raised, and she got really upset about it. And I was looking on it later, and I'm like, how come when I have a conversation with another veteran on a topic about, say, the Middle East, and I'm opposing everything they're saying, we don't really get emotionally triggered, for lack of a better word. I hate the word, and then I looked at it, I'm like, I said something that her identity was built on, and there's nowhere to go for her then. And that's a learning curve for me, because I love having these debates, but the last thing I want to do is get halfway through one and then piss someone off. And then
that's right. And you raise this point around opinions, Adrian, and I think that's really important because everyone's got an opinion, but not all opinions are equal. That's an unpopular thing to say today, right? But not all opinions are equal. Having an opinion is a right, and every right is accompanied by a responsibility. So one of the questions is, what is the responsibility that you have in forming an opinion? Yeah. So you live in a democracy, you have the right to freedom of speech, you have the right to say what it is that you think, and that's an important right within any democratic society, and it's one that wars have been fought over, and God knows how many people have died for the right to say what they think and to speak their mind. But there's also the question of the responsibility that goes with that. And the responsibility is one where you have the responsibility to be an informed citizen. You have the responsibility to be educated and reflective and thoughtful in your conversation. You have the responsibility to engage in a civil discourse, which means to really listen to what's being said, rather than just really trying to overwhelm the person with what it is that you think they should be thinking. And so the question of dialogue there becomes really important, and the nature of dialogue. There's a word in Greek sometimes is very useful here, which is parrhesia, which is fearless and frank speech. Real dialogue has to have the capacity for us to have fearless and frank speech. Yet, what we're doing in our society today is curtailing that, because if you say the wrong thing in the wrong setting at the wrong time, it can mean your end of your career, end of your job,
social suicide.
It can be, and you know, once you are on that bandwagon, it's very difficult to get off. So the death of parrhesia is the death of democracy. It is the death of civil liberal discourse, and it's very important, I think, to hold that. Now, I just want to kind of juxtapose that. Much of what, you know, regressive leftism is concerned with, I would personally be, I would say they're central concerns for me in my thinking in life as well. The issue of inequality, race, you know, violence. These are things I'm deeply interested in. It's just the answers that are being put forward, I think, are not very good. But and we've got to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Is what they're really saying is we should be concerned about our fellow human beings. I'm like, yeah, of course we should. I want to have love and care for diggers. I want to have love and care for refugees. I want to have that for everybody, and I want to engage in a kind of civil discourse about how we can find a better world to live in together. That's a bit utopian, but
if utopia is the far end of the spectrum, like aiming for it, getting there doesn't have to.
That's the idea.
It's not the destination, but getting closer to it would be a good start.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, your opinions, we talk about value systems and belief systems. The same as opinions and beliefs. They're the same thing, right? You can have a belief and it doesn't have to be a fact, and it's not a fact.
No.
It's because of your particular lens of which you're looking through the world in.
Yeah.
And they can be challenged, and people are tying beliefs to who they are, not adjusting, not having this reflection.
Yeah, exactly. Reflection's a key, isn't it? And if you think about another Greek word, you can tell I'm trained as a philosopher, but there's this wonderful Greek word. It's called paideia. It's the Greek word for education, right? And its best translation is the maturation of one's soul through death. Is that when you go into discourse, when you go into relationship, you're actually risking all of that. I'm risking that everything I thought was true could be undone because you might teach me something I didn't think was true. Many people are shocked to find out when they really start thinking about their life, they really start examining it, they're shocked to discover that their life is built on pudding. Sweet, fluffy, nonsense without substance. And so really examining your life, really thinking about your life, reflecting on your life, requires you to also then take hold of yourself and claim the ability to change your life, which is, you know, now tying back to what we're talking about in psychotherapy and psychology, is that we have to choose the life we want to live, not necessarily the life we've been given. Okay.
Is that why people, you see some speeches in universities where one particular side is doing the speech and they get shut down violently, and is it because they are so scared of what they've built their life on?
That's right.
That it's going to fall apart. They've got to shut it down.
That's the point that Adrian was making before, is about when it attacks your identity. Like, look, I often say to my students, you got three choices. You can change your mind, you can try and change the world to match your mind, and you can kill yourself. They're the three choices, right? Most people will try and change the world to match their mind. And this is how the world is. This is how I see it. This is what's going on. You're this, you're that. Yeah. I see Adrian, I see Anthony. You guys are this because that's what I want you and need you to be, right? They project onto the world. That's how most people engage the world. So you can try and get the world to do that. It never works. Yeah. The world has other ideas. You could kill yourself, as we know many, many people do, tragically every day. But there's a simpler option, which is changing your mind. But changing your mind is not something that's easy to do. Really changing your mind, like really changing how you perceive the world. When I say the mind, I'm talking about the perceptual system that builds up over the course of your life is hardwired to maintain itself because it gives you survival advantage. Right? You got here by seeing the world this way, right? But at some point, you might need to adjust and change that view. That's why novelty is often the key factor in therapeutic change, giving people novel experiences, novelty of relationship. If we talk about psychedelics, you know, what do psychedelics provide? A novel experience that disrupts perception that then has to be integrated into a new worldview. Yeah. So this sense of, you know, not wanting our sense of self, not wanting our identities, not wanting who we believe we are to be disrupted is very deep in human beings. Most people who come to psychotherapy do not come to psychotherapy to change. They come for the pain to stop. And they'll do just enough to get the pain to end.
Stop.
But radical change, to really change who you are. To, you know, one of my teachers said, reincarnation is real, you know. If you're lucky, you'll reincarnate 2 or 3 times in a lifetime. To really slough your skin, you know, to become a truly different human being. That's not an easy thing to do. That's a real challenge.
And I mean, we're working on this course modules at the moment, and it's heavily based on restructuring identity. And that exactly what you're saying, that is what's required for the military at the moment.
Yeah.
And it's hard, but we need to find some kind of model that completely transforms that person into a new iteration of themselves.
That's right. Yeah.
And it's just not there. There is nothing there at the moment. That's why people are dragging this old military identity
that's right.
through life for 50 years.
Identities are narratives. Identities are stories. And they're defined by what we might call a me, not me loop, right? There's a loop that runs. This is me, that's not me. And what's not me is just as important as what is me. And so, you know, you're training to be a soldier. What are you not? Like, what are you not?
Anymore. You're not a civvy.
You're not a civvy.
You're not lazy.
You're not lazy. You're not a pussy. You're not.
Yep.
Yeah. There's a whole series of things. So me, not me. Right. So inverse of that, I'm
disciplined,
hard, strong, tough. All right. That's all great, and that's the identity you need to do the job. But you're having thousands of traumatic exposures, right? Thousands of traumatic exposures. Average civilian has 4 to 5 traumatic exposures in their lifetime. I think the average soldier, I think it's 4,000. Police officers, same, I think. There's a massive...
Yeah, police and fireys and ambos.
Massive differences in exposures, right? So this identity is the identity that you need in order to do this thing. But then you get these traumatic exposures. And remember, trauma is not... No event is traumatic. Trauma is a response inside oneself to the event. And it's not a question of if people become traumatized, it's a question of when they become traumatized, right? Like if you just keep pushing people into these high stress situations continually, the nervous system just gives out. That's what it is. It's just the nervous system can't take it. What does that person then do with that identity? Because the traumatic experiences they're having are going to undo much of that identity. I'm disciplined, I'm hard, I'm strong, I'm resilient, and I find myself in the fetal position at home crying in the cupboard. How do those things match up? They don't. They don't fit.
Yeah, wow.
And it's fucking painful, man. Like that's difficult to deal with. So you have to find a new identity which allows you to work through all the things that have happened, change who you are, take the best of what you've learned and what you've become and become something new. You know, in the words of Nietzsche, you have to drink the fire from out of your own back. You know, you have to reconstitute yourself from those things.
So that plays into... I haven't seen the research because I don't know if it's there yet, but I had to give a talk in front of a bunch of psychs on post-traumatic stress, and I'm a firm believer that I don't think that is the number one problem in the veteran community. I don't think trauma, and I understand, like I'm starting to get a better understanding of trauma, but I do see that a lot of my mates have trauma responses, but there's nothing linking to their military career that caused that. And I've raised this kind of idea in the hope that someone way smarter than me would kind of pick it up and run with it. In that when we transition out and we don't have a transition process, there is no rite of passage. We're not rebuilding a new identity.
Right.
We're sending veterans out into the out into society with no stable understanding of who they are or what their values are. Then, like those 3 points that you just raised, I think were fantastic. Most of the boys are walking around going, my values no longer fit with the values of society.
Yeah.
And they've got no identity really, and they've latched onto their past one, and they're like, I can't change all of society. I don't really want to change my mindset because I still love the identity I've got. Number 3 is the final option, right?
Yeah.
And I looked at it, I'm like, is it possible that we're failing to transition people so they're walking around for the rest of their life? It could be the minute they get out until they're 99 with no stable identity, no structure and understanding in who they are, therefore no confidence, completely feeling isolated and lonely because the rest of society has a completely different value set. Yeah. And then they are just, they're walking around with the door open to a traumatic response in everything they do because they're so isolated and lonely. Yeah.
And look, I mean, it's important to, when we talk about trauma, I think it's important to delineate. Yeah, you got post-traumatic stress disorder, acute stress disorder, and the diagnostic criterion. But it's also important to see it as a spectrum. What is trauma? Like, what is it really? I mean, it comes from the Greek word trauma, which means wound. The way that I would normally categorize it is that it's an unexperienceable experience. It is something that just hasn't been metabolized properly. It hasn't been held through properly. And unfortunately, I think, look, there's temperaments here as well. There's certain people, I mean, you guys can tell me, what you think about this, but not every soldier is built equal, right? Like they're not all there for the same reasons. I've seen, in my work, I've seen people who just needed to get away from where they were. I've seen people who needed a job. I've seen people who were holding up a family tradition. I've seen people who wanted a legal means for killing people. And I've also seen this other subtype that doesn't really get talked about that much, but is that people just built for it. That's what they are. Like whatever genetic throwback these guys are, these are the warrior caste, these people, they don't get broken by it. It's what they're good for. That's how they live. But as a society, we have no place for them, and then there is no way of honoring them. And that becomes, I think, its own form of problem, because where do these people sit? So I think, if someone just needed to get out of where they were and they've gone and they've joined the military, often just training can be traumatizing. Just the training process can break people. And I've seen that plenty of times. And if you get someone, unfortunately, obviously some people, occasionally get killed in training and things like that. I've certainly worked with people that, have not seen active combat, but they've been damaged in those settings. So it's a full spectrum, I think, and we have to have a view of the whole process and understand where we sit as a culture and a society with violence, with trauma, and with warfare. I think you guys read that book, War is a Racket? Have you guys read that?
No.
Yeah.
No, now I'm going to have a reading list like this,
yeah,
mate.
It's a great book. It's written by the most decorated US, I think he was an officer maybe, I can't remember, but
the most decorated ones usually are because they write himself up. But.
Yeah, I think he might have been. I don't know if he was. I don't know what he was, but I remember reading the book. It was quite good, and he's just talking about, that, the whole process of war is also an economic and financial process. It's often, it often is governed by decisions that are not the decisions that people believe they're going to war for, all those kind of things. So there's
and this is what changed for me. I read a book and it was a dry, it was a recommended reading list for staff officers to go, and I was like, holy fuck! And it was a novel, like it was thick, and I was like, Jesus Christ! And it was heavy, and they were discussing in there, they're like, war. As much as like young guys go, so he's like, no, we're going to go and save the children or we're saving the women. They're like, nope, war is an arm of politics. Yeah. That is all it is. Yeah. It's not when politics fail. It is another avenue That's all we do.
And that's why it's really interesting with Putin at the moment, right? Because Putin's kind of broken an unwritten rule that's been established after World War II, is that you don't invade neighboring countries. Like you don't acquire land. You don't do that. Like it's not okay to do that.
We stopped doing that. Yeah.
Yeah. We kind of agreed that
was written up by the ones who got the most when it was still okay.
Yeah. But it's kind of this. We're going to stop doing that.
Yeah.
So war changed. After World War II around that, like the nature of the conflicts. I mean, I guess Iraq invaded Kuwait, but I mean that didn't go very well for them there. But like this movement with Putin it's a real, like you get that sense there's a real political kind of decision making. There's a real instrumentality to what he's doing there. He invaded Crimea and had a look around. No one stopped me. I do this. I do that. I do this. I do that. And I think you're spot on. I think war is an arm of politics, and I think that's something that as a society we have to own up to as well.
And I don't think that this is the problem. And I was sort of looking at the systems, and we raised these problems when we were training in Singleton. We're like, why don't we blow this course out to? And it's about seeing behind the curtain, and obviously the dizzying heights of a platoon sergeant doesn't know the strategic way that we train armies and that, but. You would go down there and you would look at what we're trying to train these kids to do. So originally, we go through the mass training of soldiers and people to go overseas. The skill sets weren't overly high. You had to give them a gun, teach them how to shoot a rifle, and follow orders. There wasn't a whole lot.
And 2/3 of them wouldn't shoot people.
Yep. Yep.
Shoot high, shoot low.
Yeah.
Correct.
Right.
And so it's just about numbers. And our training methodologies haven't really changed since like 1918, 1945. Give them a gun, give them that.
Well, have you guys read Grossman's book on killing?
On killing and on combat.
Yeah.
I'm glad we got one. You got 100 books. I'm like, I read that one.
But they said, and so we said, hey, let's get these kids. And let's teach, and now we've got to teach them combat shooting. We've got to teach them we've got to teach them all these things. And now before they leave, they've got to do 84s, Mag 58s, 9mm. They're like, you're shoving all this stuff in these kids' heads, but we're not at any point grabbing them. So you can't psychoanalyze a kid. You go and do your army psych course. Psych's like, hey, when you stand on a high building, do you feel like jumping off? And you're like, nah, like tick, off you go, mate. Good on you.
You're right.
Yeah, you join the army, not a problem. And then we get this problem of why you're joining the army, and does that align with your value systems? And will that kid or person ever have the tools, techniques, and training to deal with that situation?
Well, that's right. But what's interesting about that is perhaps what decides that is actually happen way before you get to that point. So one of the most ameliorating factors for the development of stress disorders is healthy attachment. So the first 2 years of life, it's in those first 2 years of life that the person begins to form by their relationship with their primary caregivers. And it's in those attachment relationships that the regulatory skills, the
self-soothing and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's where all that develops, right? Now, if you look at somewhere like the US, where did they used to pull their soldiery from? It was largely middle class. That's where they previously pulled it from. And in recent decades, it's all coming from lower socioeconomics.
The American military is a work for the dole program.
Yeah, right. So you get broken families, poor attachment, and as a result, you give them traumatic exposure. Poor regulatory capacities. I mean, I think that's a natural side effect is you're going to get a rapid increase in the rates of stress disorder, because it's important to understand that it's really about resources, right? Like the traumatic response, I ask these questions all the time. It's like, so women are twice as likely to develop PTSD as men, yet men are exposed to a lot more violence just in civilian life, right? These are just civilian statistics. Why is that? Well, it's about resources. In order to, when you become traumatized, you're talking about a collapse of the defensive capabilities of the person, right? Their cognition breaks down. their fight and flight response, that stops working properly. Yeah. They now kind of freeze up. Yeah. And then they get into this deep state of paralysis, right? And that's really about the resources. If you've got the capacity to fight and flight, you don't need to collapse down into these lower regions, which is where the trauma happens. But if you don't have the resources to do it, you're more likely to end up there. And so there's something very interesting about the resources that people have to cope, the endogenous resources that develop through attachment and those things, but then the resources we teach people to cope. Like, what are the actual strategies? And, what did you guys learn? Did you get a lesson on how to cope with terrible shit?
No, I don't think there was. Was there one lesson?
There was. There was 45 minutes we had of if bad shit happens overseas. They gave us like a animated box breathing technique, and they're like, just breathe slowly. Yeah, that'll solve it.
So what they
roll a cigarette or do something. Fine motor skills.
Yeah. So what they're trying to do is it's just a really basic regulatory skill, right? Like, obviously that's not going to solve the problem, but these resources and really developing inner resources in the person is really an important characteristic. When we're doing trauma treatment, we've nearly always used what we call a multiphasic treatment model. The first phase will always be some version of safety, stabilization, and resources before you approach any of the difficult experiences. Then you do controlled uncovering of experience, or controlled uncovering of memory processing, and then the last stage is some version of narrative integration, so integrating those experiences into who you are. And there's lots of different versions of this. There's 3-phase, 5-phase, whatever, but that's the general quality of it.
But the problem, all right, so here's the problem we've got. Well-adapted, high socioeconomic, educated people don't join the military.
That's right.
And I've got to believe
the boys that are broken make the best soldiers because they adapt.
Oh, they do absolutely. And I mean, this is the conspiracy mind in me is like, someone out there knows that they bring psychs in I don't know how many years ago to develop recruitment campaigns, and they're like, as any marketing does, it's like, what's the demographic you're going after?
Yeah.
And they may have said, hey, let's go for our highest performing, well-educated. And the psych's like, you got fucking no chance of getting them to join the military. Yeah. So then the demographic becomes low socioeconomic, poorly adjusted, poorly adapted people from broken homes. They love the recruitment. You hit a target, and then the military's like, we've got it. But then we realise that I believe we have, listening to you, we understand that a lot of the people from the military who have trauma issues probably started when they were kids. No one's allowed to put that into doctrine because that kills recruitment.
Yeah. It's a big problem, I think, and I think you're spot on. And I guess that question there, Anthony, is why do they make good soldiers? These that you're talking about.
So we've spoke about this a couple of times, and everyone knows. Like, I came from council housing and roughest of the rough. So there you go. There's a little bit of yell at me. I don't give a fuck. No, it's that belonging and want to be part of something. I was
going to say, be a part of a family, right? Be a part of a unit, a team. Like the sense of belonging, often the sense of belonging you get in those situations. You guys heard of trauma bonding before? You heard of that?
Yes,
term?
Or you can create relationships through shared suffering. Is that something like that?
Yeah, trauma bonding, right? It's the most powerful form of relational bonding, right? It's stronger than attachment bonding between a mother and a child. If you think about, the kind of bonding that sometimes happens between hostages and, the people who are holding them hostage, right? That kind of bonding, kind of quality. Is that the traumatic experience is so strong that in order to survive, you have to come together. You got to come together. Right, it's trauma bonding. All those action movies where, the action star, gets with some woman who he couldn't stand at the start, but after they go through this traumatic experience, they're in love. Yeah. And then after the experience, of course, it all goes away. But
in the sequel, they're always divorced.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. This is trauma bonding, right? This kind of process by which people become bonded in trauma. It happens in family violence. Yeah, so the victim can be bonded to the perpetrator. But equally, going through the things that you guys have to go through in war, Like it creates this intense bond. And, you know, the old saying, you know, blood is thicker than water. You know, it's often misapprehended. People think, do you guys know that
Is
expression?
that right? Yeah, I know the
Well, I know
expression.
the expression,
Yeah, so what it means is people who have spilled and shared blood are closer than people who have shared waters.
Yeah, normally people deliver it like family.
It's the other way
if you're
around.
related.
It's the other way around.
Yeah.
Blood is thicker than water,
Yeah.
right? Blood is thicker than water. People who have shared blood, spilled blood, are closer than those people who have shared waters. Come out of the same mum.
Gotcha.
Right, so that's
shared water. Yeah.
shared waters. Yeah, so that's where that expression comes from. So there's a lot of tightness, man. Like those, and it's very hard, I think, for civilians also to understand that degree of camaraderie, that degree of closeness, because often they don't even have that with their families, let alone
Absolutely.
you know, a friend. Like most people's friends are not at the same level of intimacy and connection that people have served together are going to have experiences of.
And that's again part of what I believe the problem is with a lot of veterans when you leave. It's like you joined searching for tribe and belonging.
Yeah.
You went through some shit together.
Yeah.
The military taught you that, well, especially in combat corps, that you're stronger together and you're useless by yourself. So they indoctrinate you with the team is stronger than the combination of all the parts put together. And then you leave and you're completely disconnected.
Yeah.
And then you're fucked. Like, and I don't think military defense and defense psychs are putting enough focus on that need to be associated with your tribe.
Yeah.
Especially for dudes. I can't speak for women because I don't know how their brains work, but disconnection from that tribal union is, I believe, the biggest problem that veterans face when we leave.
Yeah, no, I think that's a hugely important bit. I mean, that's why something like this is real cool though, right? I'm like, you got like a place, and you got a gym, and you got lads working out in the gym, and it's like these are the kinds of hubs that are probably going to be the thing that begins to resolve that.
Government started to realise we need veteran centres. I mean, they're mimicking the American model, and they're making them all like VA hospitals.
Yeah,
I'm like, we don't need more hospitals in Australia. We might, I don't know. But we need spots like this, and this is what the RSL was built for. It's like, let's provide a communal location where, back in the day, World War I and II, the old boys didn't want to come and go to the gym. They wanted to come and sink piss and tell stories. Whereas now, it's like podcast studio, gyms, we've got physios. Like, this is what I think is
yeah, no, I think you guys are onto something. I think it's, you know, I said hats off to you guys. That's why, you know, when I met up with you, I was like, if you guys need anything, let me know. I'm in. Like, I think this is so important.
So we get these real fucked up individuals. They go overseas. We haven't trained them properly, or we have, and they probably shouldn't have joined the army, and they have.
Yeah.
And then they get back, and they're stuck in this fucking brain loop, and they're going over stuff, and they get on the piss, and they keep going over and over and over.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, how do we break that looped thought cycle pattern of life? We instill these things, but is this where psychedelics come in to break the connection?
Well, I mean, that's one option, right? That's one option, is that I think psychedelics are an obvious treatment that shows good efficacy. Now, MAPS third phase trial results came out last year. Incredible results. You're looking at, after the initial treatment period, 37% of the population that were studied had completely recovered. They were non-symptomatic. 67 or 68% no longer met diagnostic criteria, and nearly 90% showed significant life increase, and they're expecting those numbers to drift upwards over time. So incredibly hopeful. Can't get too excited at seeing it as a panacea, right? It's not like it's going to fix everything. You know, it's going to be particularly good for, I think, treating indexed combat trauma. I think it's going to be particularly good for that. But, you know, it's not necessarily going to resolve lifelong pain and struggle and difficulty. I don't think that's necessarily what it's going to do. But it's incredibly hopeful. And, you know, my work with my medicine and those things has really been about, you know, just wanting to see a change. I think it's reprehensible, personally, that we know that these things are incredibly safe when used clinically, like incredibly safe. like most other medicines are not as safe as these substances when they're used in a clinical setting, and the potential for efficacy is so high. I think it's criminal that we're not using them and supporting and helping people with them, because people are killing themselves every day. People are dying, and it's like we're worried that it's not safe enough. I'm like,
the alternative's a little bit more dangerous.
Yeah, like if you don't do something, people are dying. But the political will or whatever it is, I don't know exactly how it is, and this is why my medicine's so as a I guess an agency of change has been so important in Australia to Tanya and Peter's work to try and stir things up to get this change happening. It's really kind of galvanized a lot of momentum, but I'd really love to see. They're saying that MDMA will be legalized in the US for treatment use end of next year. I just hope that Australia gets onto that as quickly as they can. Veterans need it. Sexual assault survivors need it. In the highest numbers of PTSD sufferers are sexual assault survivors, and then normally it's veterans, kind of coming down the list, or first responders. Those people need this stuff, because the other treatments are not working as effectively as they need to save people's lives. It's like it's not that fucking hard.
No,
it's just like people are killing themselves, or you can give them a medicine that's not going to hurt them and is likely to help them. I feel like that's a pretty straightforward proposition.
So what are the drugs under that umbrella? And I know that different agents have different how they affect, but how do they do this?
Yeah, well, they work differently. So the two main medicines that are used in the research are MDMA, and the other that's researched is psilocybin. Now, there's a whole bunch of others, though. I mean, there's not so much in the clinical space, but things like ayahuasca are very popular in veteran communities. There's a whole bunch of other, what's sometimes referred to as master plant teacher kind of medicines. There's a whole bunch of those, classically LSD as well. So there's a whole bunch of these. But if we just focus on the things that have been really researched heavily in the last decade, MDMA, obviously it's supposedly the active ingredient in ecstasy when people taking that as a street drug. But MDMA has this really powerful effect. What it does is it downregulates the fear centers of the brain, and it upregulates the relational connective centers of the brain. So it moves you into relationship, into being supported and held, and at the same time it allows you to approach experiences that were unexperienceable because they were too hard or too scary. So it allows you to do that. Psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, works differently. It's obviously a different kind of process. What that's doing is it's really creating a profound disruption to the network of the brain itself. So you guys probably heard of the default mode network. It's the kind of basic perceptual lens. I was talking about changing your mind, right? That's this basic perceptual kind of resting position that the mind holds. This medicine disrupts that. It disrupts it, and in disrupting it, it can allow all sorts of experiences. A lot of people who take psilocybin, about 80% of them will have some kind of mystical or transcendent experience at a large therapeutic dose, 25 milligrams. But there's also a lot of personal work that can occur. Yeah, and they're now starting to compare MDMA and psilocybin, because they were like, psilocybin's for depression, MDMA's for trauma. But of course, that's starting to be questioned now. It's like, well, why? What are they doing? What are these medicines doing? Are there ways of separating them, blending them, using them? And they have profound effects. They have profound clinical effects for people. And my view is that psychedelics are an important therapeutic tool. My personal approach is that I don't have a evangelical stance on them, right? Like some people involved in the area, they just think if you just put some psilocybin in the water, the world would be a better place, right?
We all have peace and love.
I don't feel that way. I'm almost exclusively concerned with clinical use. I have clinically for many years treated the negative effects of psychedelic abuse, and I'll highlight that.
Yeah, can we get into it? Yeah.
Yeah, abuse, is, use and abuse always need to be separated. Clinical use is not the same as recreational abuse, and I think these medicines can be really dangerous when they're abused, but certainly not as dangerous as alcohol. Just to frame that up, you know, when I say dangerous, it's it's a question of in relation to what. So I'm really a strong advocate for their clinical use. I think organising and developing one's mind is an essential responsibility of every human being. There's lots of ways of doing it. Psychedelics are often a gateway to that path. They're often a path to go, there's more. Now, meditation is probably a more stable and reliable path over time, longevity, but it's very hard to do. And we live in a society where people want things quickly. And a lot of people don't have the patience to spend 5 years on a cushion to get the same experience they could get simply by taking a substance. So I feel like all of those things have their place, and understanding that alteration of human consciousness is a basic feature of the human mind. I would go as far to say is that it's probably also a human right to be able to change your mind and to use things to support that occurring, whether that be responsible use of medicines or other technologies and experiences. I think those are really important features, because it's only those things which give us the novelty that allows us to really change our mind. And it's really novelty that does that, the novel experience. I thought the world was like this. I had this experience. It's not like that. I have to adjust. I've got to integrate those experiences together. That
makes a lot of sense, because I as I discussed when I went to that mind medicine event, I have experimented with a bunch of different psychedelics myself, more often than not. Very rarely recreationally. I know you'd call it recreationally because I didn't have a clinician there, but I was doing it for a purpose, and that's. I think that's for me when you're talking about the use cases for MDMA versus psilocybin. I'm like, for me, it's like whatever the intention is that I'm going in with.
Sure.
It's very similar, whether it's cannabis, mushrooms, or LSD in the past. Like going into it was or even DMT.
Yeah.
Like, what am I trying to get out of this, and what questions am I asking? Because that is exactly what it was for me. It wasn't. I had some dramas, like with a lot of anxiety issues, and I guess what put me onto it, I know as a kid, smoked pot a couple of times. I hated it. Made me super anxious, super paranoid. Never wanted to go near it. And then going through the military, never did recreational drugs. And then obviously Rogan's podcast was a big thing over the last decade, kind of opening people's mind, the uses behind some of this. And when he started talking about cannabis, for example, how he would meditate, smoke a joint, and really try and induce some anxiety that helped him process it. And I started doing the same, and fairly frequently over the last few years, different stages for different things, but going in with an intention to go, I'm going to try and induce social anxiety, and it's hard to process when you're high. But then for weeks after it, I had no social anxiety.
Yeah.
And then the first time I did mushrooms, same thing. But then what I realized, especially with psilocybin and then in DMT, it was like, if I had a trauma issue, it's not like an antidepressant. You eat it and then your depression goes away for a bit. No. It wasn't just going to solve it. And that was never the intent.
You got to go through it.
Yeah, and that's what, when you said then, like it helps you organize your thoughts, and that's what it did for me on any of these things. It helped me process an idea, organize thoughts, and then for me, especially with meditation, helped me strengthen and fortify my identity.
Yeah.
And that's all. When I look back at it now, that's all it was. For weeks after, I had this really strong, unbreakable identity, and nothing could hurt me.
Well, there's a few things there. The role of integration is really important clinically. I would say integration is more important than the dose session in some ways. The great challenge with psychedelics is the tension between states and stages, or states and traits. I want to come back to the cannabis thing, though. That was really interesting. But states are transient. That is, they don't last. traits or stages, depending on what language you want to use, are stabilized states, right? Each state contains a resource, right? State 1, resource 1. State 2, resource 2. You take a recipe to move you from state 1 to state 2 in order to get the resources in state 2 because you didn't have that resource before, right? Problem is, you come back to state 1 and the resource is gone. The real challenge is, how do I stabilize the resources of state 2 in the state that I come back to? And that's where therapeutic integration is really important. It's what my colleague Nigel Denning and I have done a lot of work on this over the last kind of 10 years, I'd say, looking at the role of what we call the metacognitive view. And so what these medicines often do is give you a different view. And you can mark and support the metacognitive view in the integration process so it stabilizes over time. The longer a state is maintained for, the more likely it is it will stabilize. Right?
So just stay stoned forever, you reckon?
No, exactly not that though, right? So you have to take the experience which is generated bottom up, and then what you have to do is work top down to keep the experience alive, right? So you imagine you're taking psilocybin and you're like, you can experience the whole universe, right? You can see all things, you feel everything, the trees are alive, the ground's alive, the sky's alive, everything's got this kind of quality to it. How do you feel in that moment? How do you see the world, right? How do you see the world? How do you see other people? You don't hate anyone. You don't, everything's just this part of this unified field. Violence to the other would be violence to self in this setting. So it makes you kind of calmer and kinder and all those things, right? If you can hold that experience, if you can mark that in your body so it stays alive, and you get this 5-day period of neurogenesis where the brain is changing after psilocybin, for example. If we can mark that and hold that period alive, we can stabilize those changes so that then what happened in the experience, the view that you achieved in the experience, doesn't just fade. And I'm sure you guys can kind of think about your own experiences where you had this profound experience and I'm never going to forget this, and this is going to be with me forever. And then 6 months later, it's kind of, what was that thing again? Where did that go? So clinically, the integration process is essential. And I would say in underground use, so separating out what you're describing, I wouldn't call what you were describing as recreation, I'd call it underground therapeutic use. Often the dose experience is often held quite well. There's often a lot of skill. There's often a lot of, entheogenic kind of ceremony and ritual that's brought to it from different cultures and positions. It really holds people quite well. Not always. I mean, there's lots of problems in that space as well because it's unregulated, but there's lots of good people doing that work. But I would say that the integration piece is often not done very well. And so, I know that Nigel and myself have done a lot of work, in the integration space, dealing with people who've had negative experience, have been damaged, and also positively have wanted to stabilize the work that they've done.
Yeah, well, I mean, that would absolutely make sense for me. Like I do admit there is no stabilization, especially with mushrooms or DMT, and that would be something now that I know that I would go looking for. Yeah, super important. I would say it's the most important bit. The most important bit, if it's going to be really meaningful. Yeah. If it's going to really last. Otherwise, unfortunately, psychedelics are not chemically addictive, but they can be behaviorally addictive. Yeah, that's what I found with weed, was like I understand there's no chemical addiction, but habitually it started to become a switch off point. Like if I was ADD minded for a week and I can't switch off, it's like, I know how to switch that off real quick. And I'm like, that became a habit. It was like, need to switch off. You can now work 12-hour days and go straight to sleep. Yeah. And then I'm like, it's not healthy. Well, it's interesting with the weed stuff, right? I think cannabis is this really interesting space, right? Because it's legal in Australia. There's a number of really good cannabis doctors that I know.
Jamie Rickard in New South Wales, and James Stewart in Victoria. James, myself, and Nigel are looking at putting some work together, looking at cannabis-based psychotherapy. So you can actually induce psychedelic-like experiences with some mixtures of cannabis, but they're much shorter. So 2-hour treatments, and I think that's really beneficial. But I think the CBD and THC CBD blends can be a really useful augmentation in people suffering from trauma. I think that can be a really, really useful. I would say what I've seen with that is that those medicines done at really low doses in a really manageable way, they just create this slow reshaping of the nervous system, which can be really beneficial. But that's not how most people, use cannabis.
No, cannabis and mushrooms. So, I mean, recreationally, it is macro dose to the point where there's a dude on social media talking about it was a meme, but he goes, I just ate something like 5,000 grams of cannabis, and the dude's response was, mate, go outside, hold onto the grass. Grab hold of the grass and hang onto the world with everything you got. Yeah. Because there's no way out. You're in this until it stops.
Until it's over, yeah.
And I think that is part of the macro dose kind of journey. Is like, I'm doing it to push, and you have to be comfortable. You're not going to want to do this all the time. I wouldn't recommend doing anything I do for the people listening to this, but that has been a goal at some stages. Like a couple of years ago, I know I wanted to just push as hard as I could to go see where it goes, because that whatever happens in there, you induce anxiety, you're going to have to navigate your way out, and you'll be a better person for it.
For those listening at home,
give them the actual recommendation.
If you are going to do this, do it in slow, gentle increments that allow you to be safe.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, in some ways, there's a kind of attitudinal hangover here as well. I mean, I've seen this a lot in soldiers and treating them. I can't tell you how many times, a soldier comes in for their session and they're like, all right, I'm going to fucking smash this trauma today. Let's fucking get after this fucker. Come on, I'm going to smash this cunt. I'm going to It's like, yeah, no, we're not going to do any of that. Because there's a repetition compulsion. It's like the hardness is actually part of the repetition. So one of the things is, we're talking about the identities, is finding ways of being gentler, but also not being weak, so there's this kind of tension often, I think, around vulnerability being weakness. And I think that's problematic, because what we need to do is find a way of vulnerability being kind of held as a kind of strength, and there is a kind of vulnerability which is very profoundly strong. It's a still and dignified kind of, I'm not talking about collapsing into, a pool of your own tears and snot. I mean, the ability to just be with what's there without collapsing in that way is something that we really need to cultivate for people. And I think that's something that I've seen a lot in soldiers in therapy as one of the things, one of those identity shifts, is that actually me connecting to my vulnerability is not me being weak. Yeah, like they're not exactly the same thing. And the importance of that, the importance of learning to be with what's there and to be honest with what's there without having to kind of squash it down is important. And at the same time, finding the strength to stand up and to move forward and to embrace that spirit of I canness that's really at the center of kind of human life.
Because you're quite if people are listening to this and not watching it, you're quite a dichotomy. You are a 6 foot, what, 7,
yeah.
$130,
$135,
right?
Probably should be $125.
Yeah. Multiple black belts.
Yeah.
And I'm going to fuck up all of your qualifications, like philosophy, psychology, doctorate, that is completely opposite. You would look, if people are listening to you, they would be like, he's probably got a cardigan on and some glasses if he's a philosophy professor. And,
yeah, sure.
And you're not. And
No.
and talking about, we get the hardness kind of right, because that's easy to train in quickly in the army, physicality and then into toughness. but we get mentally tough in a physical aspect, like carry this pack for 30K, it's going to hurt, and you're going to do it.
Yeah.
But we don't develop, we always talk about this, and having you on would be great, the Eastern versus Western philosophies of having that spiritual side to your warriors that can actually come in and out. We don't have that in Western society.
No, we don't. We don't. And, that expression, I'm sure you guys have heard it, it's better to be a warrior in the garden than to be a gardener in war, right? And this idea of how does one come back to the garden and appreciate it and be a part of it, but still always be what it is that you are, because you can't undo that. And so, the notion of fighting, the agon, the struggle, it breeds something in us. And there is something about human fierceness, and I think it's particularly an issue in contemporary society with toxic masculinity and all those things. It seems like that fierceness, that quality of the agon is kind of not allowed. Somehow it's negative or it's terrible, but it's really not. Obviously if it's misused, it's not. But we're not talking about it being misused. We're talking about the way it builds a sense of purpose and a sense of identity. In Kyokushin karate, they use that term us, which is a plea to one's soul to continue when pushed. Yeah, this quality of, in the hardship, I find myself. You are the stone on which I sharpen my blade. These are the kind of ideas that come up in kind of martial arts a lot, and you can't pretend to do that. And obviously, you can pretend to do that. I mean, there's a lot of mixed martial arts out there, right? Like there's, a lot of pretend stuff, but when you go to kind of really hard arts, you go to boxing, Muay Thai, Kyokushin, MMA, even judo and wrestling, those are kind of real live resistant arts. They forge something in people who actually undergo it in a serious way. You spend your time doing that, it changes you, and it, as a competitor, if you, it's a special kind of experience, getting into a cage with a, 100+ kilo person that's been training for the last 8 months to kill you, like it's like you have to find something in yourself, and something about yourself in that. And I think that's maybe the part that's often missing in our society is you don't actually know until you know. I'm sure you guys can probably talk to that in your own experience with deployment. It's like when stuff actually happens, that's when you find out. You can train all you like, but...
Yeah, and even that side of it, when you talk about rugby and team sports, you can go missing on a rugby field.
Yeah.
You're a bit of a jack cunt if you do, but you can go missing and maybe not.
Yeah.
But you go missing in a ring, you're the one that's going to suffer.
You pay the cost.
Right.
Yeah.
And you would know, you're like, I'm definitely not ready. Or whatever the battles that are going through your head.
Yeah. Like I always used to say, I used to fight a bit, and I would say I fought a lot as an amateur. I was quite successful as an amateur. Had, fought a little bit as a pro here and in Japan and stuff. And I would say I was, my coach, Richard Walsh, shout out, Urban Fight in Queensland. You guys, Nathan Corbett. Do you know Nathan Corbett? Carnage Corbett?
Oh, yeah.
That rings a bell.
Yeah, anyway, Richie trained him as well. And, Richie describes me as the laziest fighter he's ever met. So I don't really like exercise. I just like fighting, right? I don't really, all the running and all these things, I know for myself, I used to feel real good when I was winning. But when I started losing, I'd be like, what am I doing here? Got all these university degrees and getting punched in the head. This is shit. And it's amazing how in those hard moments, you can persuade yourself out of the fight.
Absolutely.
And really, that's what it's that micro moment where you decide, do I roll over and give up here, or do I just push that little bit? And I think it's often really interesting in those settings is, if you just are not complicit with the situation, if you resist it, even just a little bit, it might feel impossible, but just a little bit of resistance often is enough to turn the tide, because the other guy's giving it everything he's got, and you just go 1 point above it and things shift. And yeah, I really think that part of the human psyche, that part of us, and particularly of men, really needs to be cultivated. You know, I train a lot of professional MMA fighters and things like that over the years, and you know, they are not the stereotypes that people think about of some thug out there wanting to beat. They're all good kids, working hard, training hard, and like it's meaningful for them. And people are like, oh, they shouldn't do it. I'm like, well, I agree, right? I understand personally, but also psychologically and neurobiologically what's happening to them, right? Like I can't tell you how, you know, I'm just watching people's get hit in the head, and I'm like, oh my God, because I know the science of what's happening to them each time they get hit, right? The neuronal shearing, all that stuff. But I also will say to those people who think they shouldn't do it, if you've got to fight, you've got to fight. You can't, like, it's something they need to do. So let's create a safe container for them. Let's support them to work it through. And when it's worked through, let them move on to something else. Let it be what it needs to be for them. And, you know, that's certainly been my attitude over the years. And yeah, so, I believe in the value of the agon, of the struggle, of combat. I believe that it's good for people. You know, you reference being trained as a philosopher, but, you know, Theodosius, a historian of the Peloponnesian Wars, said a society that separates its warriors from its scholars has its fighting done by fools and its thinking done by cowards.
And that's where we are. Look, so I've got a question that'll cause a lot of people to hate me, but I don't think our audience is too worried. I mean, we're looking a lot like ancient Rome now, and there was the good perfect separation where you had a warrior kind of element to society, and then you had the senators, and they were generally beta males or less physically statured men. And I'll butcher the shit out of it, but there is a fairly recent kind of rat study where they showed they gave a society of rats all the food, all the sex, and what they wanted for nothing. Yeah. And the population just exploded really quickly as it does with rats. And eventually the population was so big, but because there was no need to fight for food and mates, the number of alphas kind of hit a point where there was no need hierarchically for any more alphas in this society. So all of the rest of the males that were being born became betas, and eventually they started to use manipulative psychological techniques to bring women to them, to steal food, because they didn't have the stature within that society. Is that where we are in the Western world now? Have we got too many betas?
That was Rattopia or Rat?
Oh no, Rat Park was the cocaine study, but this I don't know what this one was called.
Well, there's a few things to say about that. First of all, the notion of alpha and betas in Homo sapiens is untrue, first of all, right? So there's no such thing as alpha and betas in Homo sapiens, right? That doesn't exist because of the variety of settings, right? You can have a banker in a boardroom meeting with the world heavyweight boxing champion, and in that encounter, like, the banker is the alpha, right? You know, this is the most dangerous man on the world, but this is, you know, so you have to kind of soften some of the expectation. I know that that's a good shorthand for what we're really talking about is the role of kind of physical dominance, physical prowess, physical strength, and the characteristics of kind of what we might call traditional masculinity. Yeah, I think those things are changing. Some of that for the good and some of that for the bad. You know, I mean, we need to hold the line there and not romanticize the negative features of it, you know, but at the same time be able to pick out what is really good about it. What are the things that have really allowed this stuff to, you know, what has it done for us? Yeah, as a people and as a species, and it's done a lot. It's also done some harm, and I think it's important not to minimize that. There are problems with that if that's the dominant and only discourse available to you. What we need is something more balanced. You know, we need a series of virtues to live by. But my view is that strength and capability are important. I mean, I personally, you know, and this is just completely personally anecdotal revelation of my own psychology, I don't understand what it's like for a man who's untrained to be in the world. I actually don't. I can't grasp it. You know, you talk about this dichotomy for me and all those things. I grew up really hard, like super hard. And, you know, we're poor and life was difficult and there's lots of violence around. So I'm like, I'm going to get hard and I'm going to get smart. So all these things that people are like, oh, you've done all these achievements, they're just psychological compensations for survival, right? This is how I survived.
Yeah.
And the you know, the qualities of those things, the value of that strength, I think, is really undervalued by a lot of people today until they need it. Yeah, and that's the reality, is like at some point life will push you to your knees. Yeah, and as the saying goes, you don't rise to the occasion, you sink to the level of your training.
Yeah, and that's the Gardner in a war kind of
that's right.
scenario all over again. And I look at too, like I've been knocked out too many times playing footy and I was around too many bangs. I am concerned that my brain, the shelf life has been reduced a little.
Yeah.
And I talked to the boys, we've got this veteran kind of charity boxing thing coming up. And I'm like, I think I'm going to have to get back into have a crack, even though I'm nervous about my brain.
Jiu-jitsu, mate.
Well,
give
yeah,
the boxing a miss and just do jiu-jitsu.
But you won't get corporates to come to a charity jiu-jitsu. They'll be asleep after the first fight. But that's what keeps me kind of wanting to get back into it. I'm like, yes, my brain might last an extra 20 years, 10, 20 years.
Yeah.
But if I walk down the street and someone tries to jump me right now, I'm fucked. Like I haven't trained to throw hands in a decade.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm like, yes, that's also part of the fear-based kind of thing going, well, you've got to be ready for any threat, even if there is no threat there. But I think that's still a good way to be because like what you're saying, no one cares. Everything's survival-driven and no one cares about my survivability more than me.
Yeah.
I can't leave myself in the hands of other people.
Well, you know, you talk about this fear orientation. I think that's really interesting, right? Is like, if you think about Eastern practices, coming back to that thing you talked about before, and before you begin meditating, you undergo what you call your preliminaries, which is the movement from a fearful, negative mind to a joyful, compassionate, positive mind, right? This is this transit. And then you're meant to start meditating. This quality is often lost on people. When I talk to veterans that I've treated, you know, hypervigilance is often a real issue. Yeah? And I'm like, what would it mean to change or shift your hypervigilance to awareness? Yeah. Now, the perception is the same, but what's motivating the perception is different. Yeah. Hypervigilance is a fearful-based perception mode. Awareness or expanded awareness, you're still aware of all the things in your environment, but it's not being driven by being afraid. It's actually driven by being calm and relaxed and centered. That transition, I think, is really, really important. It's one of the most important things to develop. And there's been a lot of research into this into the military in recent years, you know, with the development of kind of flow state experiences in combat and those kind of things. But that capacity to just have an open, clear awareness, if you can take the fear component out of the hypervigilance, that's what you get. You actually get an expanded awareness of the environment, which is actually a resource. It's actually an amazing thing. It's actually a heightened state of being without the kind of, you know, the negative effects on your body and your nervous system of being kind of mobilized the whole time and being terrified the whole time. And so what I would say is that training actually allows you to relax into the environment because you're like, I'm good, you know. I'm good. If something happens,
I think
I'm good.
That's connected to the tribal connection thing as well. Like when you are trained in the military to be hypervigilant when you perceive you're in a threat environment, but even when you know, like you see a bad dude or you know there's a high threat coming up, your body's physically does become more alert, more aware, go into fight or flight or whatever you're going through. But most of the boys still feel calm and safe because they've got their mates there.
Yeah.
It's different when you leave.
When you're alone, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, even the effect that this has on, I think we spoke about it on a podcast before, about you see young, violent kids and, you know, and you get them into boxing and you get them into training, and it doesn't have the effect people think it does. It doesn't make them more violent. It calms them down.
The opposite effect.
They don't go looking for fights.
No, it has the opposite effect on them normally. I mean, not always, but normally it has the opposite effect. Right? It normally channels, contains, controls. And look, you know, founder of karate, Gichin Funakoshi, said the ultimate aim of karate lies not in victory or defeat, but in the perfection of its participants. And so there's the martial part, right? There's the war part, but there's also the art part. And over time, what happens is you begin to fall in love with an art form, not with the display of violence, so to speak. You know, like Ares, you know, the Greek god of war, was not loved, you know, by the Greek people. Ares was brutal, bloodthirsty, all those things. But you juxtapose that against Athena, who was the other Greek deity of war, and she was about strategy, planning, calmness. And it's the balance of Ares and Athena which really martial arts provide to people a lot of the time. And I think good training generally does that. And I mean, when I say martial arts, I don't mean just traditional combat arts. I mean, you know, I've seen that happen in shooting, archery, you know, any of those kind of things. It becomes a kind of meditation, you know. And I know guys who feel that way when they go shooting, you know, it's like this Zen experience for them. It like, it calms them, it soothes them, they get into this moment, you know, just them, their breath and the target, like whatever you need to do. I think it's good, you know. So yeah, I really believe in that stuff.
Because there's a lot of utility, like Stoicism, and we talk about the old Stoics and that now. Is there stuff that you see now that you're trained in it, where people have co-opted and you're like, that's not you, mate. That's from, you know.
Yeah, of course. Of course, yeah.
And do you see, I've got recommended by one of my mentors, like a couple of books like Modern Stoics and that, and I found real utility in it.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I've got a fair bit of the Stoics in me. I think I read Meditations by Aurelius probably when I was 12 or 13, I think. And so it kind of runs fairly deep in me, but I always have a kind of a reluctance with the Stoics in the sense that there's a kind of, like, what do I love about the Stoics? Virtue. Virtue is the virtue, right? Yeah, like that I think our society is lacking in people who are virtuous, right? People, like, really lacking. We have privileged people and incentivized people to be dirtbags. Like, that's what we've done in our society. We haven't privileged and incentivized virtue. So I love that about the Stoics. The notion of eudaimonia, you know, the flourishing soul in Stoicism, you know, really takes the form of living through these virtues. But there's also a kind of rigidity or concretization, almost go as far to say as a denialism in some Stoicism that I always get a bit sketchy about. It's like you're trying to suppress these natural instincts. And for me, that's why, you know, if I think of the philosopher that I turn to for life, you know, rather than the Stoics, I actually turn probably more to Nietzsche, you know, Friedrich Nietzsche's works. Because Nietzsche is, you know, Nietzsche will say something like, it is no small feat to overcome the tragedy of life, right? It's no small feat to do that. But in order to do it, you have to have an abundance of cheer. There are no great deeds that do not come from an abundance, right? In order for me to take on a poison river, I need to be a great ocean, right? These are the kinds of things that Nietzsche says. There's a kind of expansiveness to Nietzsche. It's like, I'm going to be more magnanimous. I'm going to be bigger. I'm going to be more. You know, in Twilight of Idols, there's this great little section where it's a conversation between a piece of coal and a diamond, you know, and the piece of coal is like, why thou so hard, brother? And the diamond says, "Why thou so soft, my brother? Would not you carve yourself upon a millennia? Would you not flash and cut?" You know, and it's so my view is, rather than kind of trying to suppress yourself into the, you know, denial that can come through with some stoicism, my view is like, be more, be bigger, be trying to do this service in a small piece, but your listeners will be able to tell I'm kind of big on the Greeks. But two of the great deities that are important to know are Dionysus and Apollo. And Dionysus really plays in with a psychedelic piece. Apollo is the god of light, sunshine, the sun, logic, rules, law, right? Carved out of marble, clear, masculine. The other deity is Dionysus, neither male nor female. Born of a woman, but sired by Zeus, trained in the Eleusinian mystery schools, so in the psychedelics, right? That's the training. Now, what happens is there's a famous play by called The Bacchae by Euripides, and it tells this story of Dionysus returning to his home place, right, where he was born. And he returns, and as he returns, all the women run out of their homes and form a female horde. And they arrive at the city. And he asks Pentheus, who's the king, and in Thebes, this city, they worship Apollo. They worship reason and reason alone. He says, "Acknowledge me, or I'll destroy you." And Pentheus says, "No." Okay. Dionysus comes into the city. The walls of the city fall. The weapons and armor fall from the soldiers. The women and the prisoners run free, right? Think about this as the human psyche, right? The rigid, these are the rules, this is what I've got to have. This energy, this disrupts all that. It breaks, so it's madness. It breaks all this up. My psychological defenses fall. All my weapons, all my protections, they all fall apart. And the things that are trapped underneath come up, right? All the things from below. And at the end of the story, Pentheus goes out and he's walking among the horde, and his mother kills him, and she holds up his head. She says, "Look, I've killed a lion." The reason, the head, the rational bit is destroyed. And so there's this tension between the Apollonian, the rational, controlling part, and the Dionysian part. When we engage in psychedelics, what we're doing is we're bringing psychedelics to Apollo, right? The Apollonian mind is blown apart. You meet Dionysus. Unbridled Dionysus is madness. But there's also an Apollonian kind of madness as well. That's what we see in our world, like the politics and all that. It's a kind of Apollonian madness. And so finding a way of bringing those together. Now, Nietzsche says, we Hyperboreans who worship Dionysus. Hyperborea is the land of the sun in Greek mythology. So we're Apollonians, but we worship Dionysus. You see, so it's like these are not mutually exclusive. Yeah, I'm not going to be all like pure and no, it's got to be like this, and there can never be any, there can't be any of these feelings or difficulties or struggle. No, it's both and. And so I sometimes use an analogy. Apollo is a glass of water. Dionysus is a glass of wine. If you drank the wine by itself, it'd drive you mad. The water's pretty fucking boring.
That's good.
The middle path is the wine watered down just enough to make things interesting. So sometimes when I think about Stoicism, I feel like it's a little bit like
a glass of water.
Just have the glass of water, man. And I'm like, yeah, but there's more to us than this. There's more to us. And psychedelics in some ways are the natural craving for that Dionysian impulse. They're the natural desire to explore consciousness and the mind.
Is yin-yang balance the fundamental kind of bridge between every philosophy through history?
Well, the middle path, yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? So you think about societies that haven't held the middle path, and probably the most interesting one that I fucking love Spartan history, right? I fucking love it. It's just the best. But they were a completely unbalanced society. It destroyed them. Destroyed them. Like they couldn't survive. And when you look at the fall of societies, you brought up Rome before, the fall of empires, it's when they move out of balance. They get into these kind of tensions that are unreconcilable. And so, yeah, I think finding the middle path with those things is important socially, but also personally. And finding that point of balance is, is something we should strive for, I think.
Yeah, no, because that makes a lot of sense and has a lot of value for me, because I've tried to be more stoic. Stoicism is kind of something I've read a little bit into, and I'm like, I love, because I'm a very logic kind of minded person, but at the same time, blow out and get super chaotic.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's where I'm at now. And I love the idea of stoicism, but then every time I have this like uncontrolled emotional response, I look back and go, that was pretty negative. You can do better at that. I always learn something from it. And I'm like, I do, like you say, I need to put a few walls around the chaos and then just let it go for a bit. And
yeah, well, Nietzsche famously said, one must have chaos within oneself to give birth to a dancing star, right? So it's an engine, that drives the human psyche. It's the unconscious. It has that quality to it. So, yeah, I love a lot of Stoic philosophy and a lot of the values, particularly around the virtue. I mean, the stuff on virtues, I'm like, I can't get enough around. It's just the suppression of pathos. Sometimes I get a little, rather than being suppressing, it would just be more than it. Just be more than it. Why in this situation would I just try and detach myself and just be like completely relaxed and calm when I can be completely relaxed and calm because I'm bigger than it? What does Nietzsche say about that? He says, I can't remember the quote. It's something like, what to you is a rain cloud is merely my feet, or something like that. Like you're like, oh my God, it's so heavy. And he's like up above it. Right? Yeah. It's just like above it. It's just like, yeah, it's all good. And so the word there that I love to use is magnanimity. Be magnanimous, be bigger, be more virtuous, be larger. And I feel like that intention with some of these virtue values that you're kind of talking about are fantastic. So if I'm looking for the control part or the regulation part, I'd actually go to Buddhism, because it's a much more nuanced approach, which gives you that same kind of capacity to manage. Now, you probably all heard, Buddha said life is suffering. But that's actually a really bad translation. It would be better read as life is reactivity. Like we're naturally reactive beings. The human mind has a negative perceptual bias of 6-to-1, right? So like we will naturally orientate to bad things at a ratio of 6-to-1, right? So like it's a real effort to move our mind away from the negative and from the bad. And so one of the things that Buddhism teaches is the capacity to regulate one's feelings, right? And to regulate one's mind and to hold one's mind in a kind of open state. And so I guess for me personally, that's really the practice that's been with me around that. And whereas Stoicism is really, you're doing it forcefully from the top down, Buddhism is actually a practice which actually makes you that way. So you actually stop being reactive. There was an experiment done with some Zen monks in Japan, and they get into a meditative state. They got the helmet on, checking their brainwaves, and they let off a cap gun. And instead of getting a startle response, inverted startle response, they become more relaxed when the gun would go off.
Well, do you know what? They did this with you probably might know. So they said you get a veteran.
Yeah.
And you get him and you start putting some combat indicators in there that the contact is going to happen.
Yeah.
and you get a soldier who's never been in combat, so a proper proper veteran, and you give him combat, so you give the unexperienced guy these combat indicators. Their heart rates went through the roof. They panicked. They started, rest rates went up, everything, and then the gunshot went off and just spiked completely. Whereas the veteran, they saw the combat indicators, and the heart rate, rest rate went up. And then the gunshot goes off and it drops down.
Settle into it. Exactly. So you get these kind of shaping experiences. Like, that's anticipatory, right? I don't know what's going to happen. I know something's going to happen. I know what's happening. All right. So now we're good to go. Yeah, fantastic stuff, isn't it? Very interesting. The human mind and the human body is just so incredible, like what it's capable of and the things that we can do and learn from. And you know, many of us never really, in our society, as Adrian's pointed to before, never really experience our capabilities. You know, everything's, you know, so comfortable and convenient, deodorized, manicured, you know, sterilized into safety all the time. And this is one of the big problems, is the question of risk. You've raised this issue of rites of passage. Yeah, rites of passage are interesting because they always, you know, traditionally would involve risk, like real risk. You know, I always give this example of in Central America somewhere, I can't remember, I read this, but there's a snake initiation for these shamans. And they dig this pit, fill it up with vipers. They put the shamans in there. The good shamans can walk through the pit out the other side, persuading the snakes not to bite them. The reasonable shamans can get bitten and transmute the poison and not die, and the ones that should have chosen something else are dead. Right? You know, like these are real undertakings. You either live or you die by it. Like these are not play things. These are not recreational.
It's like Vanuatu as well, isn't it? With the rope, the vine jumpers.
Yeah.
Like the vine snaps, you die.
You died.
It doesn't, you're a man.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a whole bunch of these kinds of initiations, you know, throughout history, and they're, you know, like we look at them and we're like, oh my God, this is an health and safety nightmare, you know.
Well, I mean, Spartans are the best one. It's like, as a boy, you get sent out. It's like, you want to be a man in our tribe? Make it back. That's it.
Yeah. Make it back sometime. Yeah. Here's the stick. You know, no, exactly right. And so the question of risk, like, what are you prepared to risk? Like, what are the risks that you're prepared to undertake for the transformation when you live in a society that's completely risk adverse, where you're not allowed to take any risks? Like, you're literally not allowed to take any risks. You're like,
there's a law against it.
Yeah, there's laws against it. You can't do this. You can't do that. You can't do this thing. I'm like, well, that's great, but where does that leave us? And, you know, I mean, there's a lot of attempts to try and create safe rites of passage and all those things, which is great. Like, I'm not dissing that at all. I think we need something. But the question of risk is a big deal. Like, I need to know something about myself that often I'll only find in those moments or not find.
Yep.
You know, like, is it the Maasai? You know, they tie a skin around their arm and walk up to a lion, stick their arm in the lion's mouth and stab the lion. Is that, you know, like?
Yeah, I'm good.
I'm like, I'll just opt out of that one, but, you know, but you know something about yourself in that setting, don't you? So
yeah, I think ceremony and ritual. I think when we lost the church, and I'm not religious, but I think some of the things that the church instilled, community, religion, ritual.
No, I think you're spot on.
Even the stuff like when you have to pray at dinner time and all these like acceptance and we lost that when we didn't replace it with anything, and now people are choosing their own adventure.
No, well, this is the whole thing, man, right? So I'm harping on about Nietzsche today, but, you know, Nietzsche said, God is dead and we have killed him. And he essentially prophesized the nihilism of today. Because if you do not have a cosmological meaning given to you, then what you have to do is you have to create that meaning yourself. And so you have to actually create a meaning beyond yourself in order to make life worth living. And who today actually has that? We live in a world of selfish individualism, what the philosopher Charles Taylor would call an immanent frame, you know, where there is no transcendence possible. right? Transcendence is God. We've killed God. So we've killed God up there, and we've stopped talking to the trees and the plants and the animals down here. So who is there? There's just human beings. There's one voice, and that one voice is lost in a sea of other voices doing the same thing. And so how do we find meaning and purpose? How do we find direction? How do I develop a personalized meaning? Well, I think you have to find a commitment to something bigger than you. Something bigger than you. And you have to serve something. We all have to serve something. And unfortunately, a lot of people are serving things today that are going to destroy them, the society, the planet, whatever. We need to find a more thoughtful way of figuring out what we serve. Yeah.
Absolutely. Mate, my brain is going to hurt for 3 days after this podcast. That's been 2 hours of.
How's it 2 hours?
That's 2 hours.
That's went quick.
That's gone quick. All right, very good. I mean, you guys want to finish up, or you want to keep going, or what do you want to do?
Well, I think we've covered main topics, and you're definitely someone that we want to get on again.
Yeah, it's just something we keep coming back, and
no, happy to come back anytime. I just want to say thank you to you guys for all the work you're doing. I said I'm 100% supportive, helping out diggers and veterans, and anything I can do to help, let me know. But keep up the good work, lads.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, mate. Just before we go, what have you got coming up? What's going on in the world? What's keeping you busy and occupied?
A lot. I've just changed one of my job roles. So just got this associate professor role, so hopefully doing a bit more teaching and whatnot. My medicine has a whole bunch of stuff coming up. Obviously, there's rescheduling applications that have gone in. There's clinical training going forward. Nigel and myself, continue to work in the space and to support this stuff moving forward. Look, I probably should have you could check us out on something or other, but I don't, unfortunately.
You don't run your own socials?
No,
not
I can barely do an email, mate. I can barely do an email.
That's probably healthier.
So I probably next time I'll make sure there's something like that. But if people are interested in anything, I do have a web page. There's Mind Medicine Institute and Mind Medicine Australia. Both have web pages and contact pages there. So reach out. If we can help, we will. But I've neglected to do this. Next time I'll get onto this. This is absolutely the self agent.